We are in our final week of this sermon series looking at the ending of a few books of the Bible. And so I'm curious, are any of you the kind of people who, when you get a new novel, you flip to the back and you peek at the ending before you read the whole thing? Does anybody do it? Thank you. One person was brave enough to raise their hand at 8:30, and I gasped. So clearly you know how I feel about this. I had a friend who used to do this. They would, before they even read a single paragraph from the front of the book, they would flip to the back and they would read the last few pages to find out how things end, and then they would go back and start the book. Now, y'all, that's madness. That's anarchy. Don't skip to the end. Don't skip all the character development and the twists and the turns of the plot as it was designed to be read. It messes with the whole book reading experience. You lose the suspense and the curiosity. It's like watching the movie before you read the book. Don't do that. Now, rant aside, I've found the exception to the rule. In opposition to all of my instincts, I think that the book of Hosea is the book of the Bible where you actually need to start at the end. And I can't believe I'm recommending such a thing, but I think the book of Hosea is better read a little bit backwards. Now, here's why. The words we read this morning that are the final verses of the book of Hosea, these are filled with these beautiful promises of restoration and hope. But they come at the end of a book that is a pretty tough read. The whole book is pretty rough until the end because Hosea is a book of judgment. So time again throughout Hosea, time and again, you will read words where God is declaring that God is done with God's people. God is ready to punish them and cast them out. And the imagery is very vivid and harsh. But then you get to these words at the end and it's like this sweet relief. These promises that God will love them freely and will heal their disloyalty, that God will protect them and give them life and nourish them. And you need all of that beauty and all of that imagery to make it through the first 13 chapters of Hosea. You need these promises of hope to make it through what precedes. You need to know that restoration and hope are coming in order to read the rest of Hosea. So if you've never read this book before, here's just a little crash course into the book of Hosea. Hosea was a prophet in the northern king of Israel between 750 and 722 BCE. And when you're flipping through your Bible, Hosea is the very first of the 12 minor prophets in the Old Testament. Now, we call them minor because they're shorter books, not because their message was minor or their impact was minor. The message of the prophet Hosea that Hosea wants to convey is God's judgment. So, not the most joyful reading to be found. And the reasons for that judgment are quite clear in the book. The prophet says to the people that the people of Israel have violated their exclusive covenant relationship that they have with God. They've turned to other kings that God does not approve of. They've treated people in ways that are contrary to the ways of God. And they've worshipped other gods that are not big G God. Now, you might say, well, that sounds like a lot of the other prophets too, so what makes this one so much harder to read? What I think makes Hosea such a difficult book to read is because, at least for me, the primary metaphor that Hosea uses for this message of God's judgment is the image of a marriage. The marriage covenant between God and the people of Israel has been broken. Israel has cheated on God. And so to help the people understand this, God instructs Hosea to marry a woman who is unfaithful. And then the book lays out the pain of Hosea's life with this woman. And that pain is then meant to lay out for the people the pain that they inflict upon God when they are unfaithful to God. So we're asked to imagine that God feels pain and grief when we turn away or when we damage our relationship with God. Hosea will turn away from his wife and then take her back. God will do the same with Israel. And this is all laid out very boldly and with imagery that's quite difficult to read at times. The first 3 chapters of the book contain language of violence towards the wife for her unfaithfulness and for breaking the marriage covenant. And it goes without saying that no person, no woman, no man, regardless of their behavior, should be treated in the ways that are lined out in those early verses of Hosea. But it's reading those early verses in this book and considering this idea of our God in pain that we are invited to keep reading and to get to this place of restoration and hope that will emerge from such a dark and broken place. After all of these difficult words that talk about doom for the people of Israel and doom for Hosea's wife, we are quite in need of Hosea's final message that's filled with all these plant-based images of lilies and dew and the fragrant gardens of Lebanon. By the time we get to chapter 14, we are in need of those images to show us that in spite of what has preceded, God still promises that the people will grow and thrive, that God still promises to love them freely, that God still promises restoration and hope. You see, at the heart of Hosea's prophetic message is this idea of faithfulness. God has called the people of Israel to be faithful, and they have failed. Contrary to that, God's faithfulness does not fail, nor will it ever fail. This is the good news of the book of Hosea. This is where we should begin, at the end, at these promises from God to be faithful and loving, to provide life and flourishing, not just now, but forever. Because when we have those promises at the end in mind, then we can read the rest of the prophet's message and we can hear about this pain and suffering of God that's so central to what Hosea has to say. And while that doesn't excuse some of the violent imagery in the book, it can help us make sense of it. God promises to be faithful forever. God has assured us of love and care and life. And even when we've squandered those promises, even when we've frustrated or angered or pained God, still, God promises to show up for us like that evergreen in verse 8, always green, always faithful. In that same verse, it says, I am an evergreen, and then it says, your faithfulness comes from me. God's faithfulness then provides the foundation for our own. Hosea reminds us that we can always trust in God's faithfulness, even when we're struggling, even when we feel like we are not deserving of God's grace and mercy, even when we know that we have wandered and struggled. Still, we can trust in God's faithfulness, and that faithfulness might be the source for our own. I came across a story a while ago, and it caught my eye because it takes place in Philadelphia, which is a city that I love. When I was in seminary, I interned at 2 different churches in Philly. And so a couple times a week, I would take the train into the city from New Jersey, and I would get out at the Center City station, and I would walk to whichever church I was headed to that day. And the walk was, 15 or 20 minutes across the city, depending on which church. So I made that walk on really beautiful sunny days. I made that walk on some very snowy winter days, some rainy days. And you get to know a city in a different way when you walk its streets. And something you notice when you walk around very much in Philadelphia is what we already know, that Philly is an old city. And because of that, the sidewalks are in pretty rough shape. Some of those are that original cobblestone, some of them are brick, some of them are just plain old concrete. But in lots of sections of the city, the sidewalks are crumbling, and the city can't quite keep up with all of the repairs on the aging streets. So the story I found was about an artist in the Fairmont neighborhood who, instead of complaining about crumbling sidewalks or being angry about the state of disrepair, they started quietly filling the cracks and the holes in the sidewalk with beautiful mosaics filled with color. She started filling in these holes or spots where a brick might be missing or there might be a big crack with all sorts of mosaics. Some of them look like dog paw prints. Some of them look like birds or flowers or fish. Some of them are just full of color. But there are all these beautiful little mosaics embedded right there into the cracks and the brokenness of the sidewalk. So if anybody's headed to Philly anytime soon, if you find yourself on Mount Vernon Street, you can see these mosaics that go on for blocks that are filling in the brokenness with beauty. And as I read Hosea, I can't help but find myself thinking about those cracks in the sidewalk and the artist that's filling them with something different. The brokenness of the sidewalk doesn't go away. The cracks are still there. They aren't made to disappear. But now, in addition to the brokenness, there's also beauty shining from within it and inviting people to experience the broken sidewalks and the crumbling streets in a different way. Now they're filled with wonder and delight and creativity. And I think the same is true for this story of Hosea. As we consider God's faithfulness in opposition to our tendency as human beings to be unfaithfulness to God, the brokenness there will always remain. We will, as human beings, always be prone to wander away from God. We'll make mistakes or let our priorities get askew and need to be called back to God. We will always struggle to stay faithful to God. There will always be that little bit of brokenness, that little bit of crumbling of the way things should be. But God does not leave things at that. God insists on remaining faithful, and that is the beauty that fills in the brokenness, that shines through the cracks and the crumbling. God's faithfulness is the thing that invites us to wonder and delight and joy and love. That's what fills the brokenness, and it fills our mistakes, and it fills our wanderings, and it covers them up with something else. We're invited, even in our own moments when we lack faithfulness, to see the faithfulness of God shining through, steady through any struggle. God's faithfulness is not going anywhere. God's promises of restoration and hope, God's promise to love us freely, those are always just that little touch of beauty shining through the cracks, inviting us to turn back to God. Friends, this is the good news of Hosea. Like the words of our next hymn, great is thy faithfulness. God's faithfulness shines powerfully through all of our brokenness, all of our struggles, all of our moments when we fail to stay faithful to God. God's faithfulness does not fail, and God is always moving us towards these promises of restoration and hope, no matter how harsh or how broken things might seem along the way. There are always these promises of restoration and hope on the horizon. There's always that beauty shining through the brokenness. And for that, we say thanks be to God. Amen.